There's a moment every gardener hits in July. You're standing at the edge of your beds, sweating through your shirt before 9 in the morning, watching your spring lettuce bolt and your peas shrivel on the vine, and a thought creeps in that feels almost reasonable. Maybe the season's basically over. Maybe from here, it's just watering, weeding, and waiting for fall cleanup to start. I want to tell you about the July. I actually believe that, because I did for one entire season, years ago, and what happened next is the reason I'm making this video right now. That year, by the second week of August, my garden was almost completely empty. Spring crops gone. Nothing planted to take their place. I remember standing there, looking at beds full of bare dirt in the middle of what should have been peak production season, and thinking I had the whole summer. What did I actually do with it? That failure taught me something most gardening advice skips over entirely. July isn't the end of planting season. It's a hinge point. It's the single month that decides whether your garden quietly dies off in September or keeps feeding you all the way into November, December, sometimes longer than you'd think possible if you live somewhere with a real winter. Today I'm walking you through 7 crops that need to go in the ground this month. Not because some calendar on the internet says so, but because of what specifically happens to each one of these if you wait, even another 2 or 3 weeks. A couple of these are going to surprise you. One of them, I genuinely didn't believe the first time a more experienced gardener told me about it. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why those bare August beds don't have to happen to you the way they happen to me. And stick around, because at the end I'll also cover how to actually protect everything you plant from the part of summer that's about to get genuinely brutal. Let's start with a crop that taught me the hardest lesson of all. I'd been growing bush beans all spring, productive, reliable, exactly what you'd expect from a beginner-friendly crop. And like a lot of gardeners, I assumed that once they slowed down, the bean chapter of my garden was closed for the year. Beans felt like a spring and early summer thing. You plant them, you harvest them, you move on. What I didn't understand yet is that beans have a second act, and July is the short window where it happens. If you get a fresh round of seed into the ground now, you get a complete new harvest, right as everything else in your garden starts struggling against the worst of the heat. The trick isn't really about variety selection. It's about the math of the calendar. Bush beans typically mature in 50 to 60 days, which means a July planting finishes right as the harshest heat starts breaking and pest pressure. Things like Mexican bean, beetles, and aphids naturally starts dropping off. Here's what nobody explained to me at the time, and it's the kind of detail that changes how you think about your entire garden calendar going forward. The real value of succession planting isn't just stacking up extra harvests. It's that you're always working with young, vigorous plants instead of old, exhausted ones. A bean plant that's been fighting heat and pests since May is running on fumes by August. A bean plant you started in July is hitting peak production, exactly when the older ones are calling it quits. If you got a bare patch right now, where your spring beans used to be, that's not dead space. That's an opportunity sitting there, waiting for you to notice it. I'd also say, if you've never grown a heat-tolerant variety like a yard-long bean or a black-eyed pea type, July is honestly the best month of the year to try one, because they actually prefer the conditions everything else hates. Now, beans were the lesson that first opened my eyes, but the crop that really proved the point, the one that made me realize how much I'd been getting wrong, was something I almost laughed at when that same experienced gardener brought it up to me in the middle of July. Carrots. I said exactly what you might be thinking right now. Carrots are a spring crop. You plant them when it's cool. You harvest them before the real heat sets in. Planting carrots in the thick of July sounded, to me, like setting them up to fail before they even had a chance. But here's the piece of plant biology that changed my mind, and almost nobody explains it clearly. Carrot germination depends heavily on consistent soil moisture, and the seedlings actually tolerate a wider heat range than what most people assume, as long as you keep that top inch of soil from drying out completely between waterings. The real secret isn't the planting temperature at all. It's the harvest temperature. A carrot seeded in July spends its vulnerable early weeks in warm soil, which actually speeds up germination quite a bit compared to a cold spring sowing, and then matures right as temperatures cool into fall. And carrots that finish their growth in cooler weather develop noticeably sweeter flavor, because the cold triggers the roots to convert stored starches into sugar, essentially as a natural antifreeze mechanism. So that carrot you're picturing as some fragile, cool weather only vegetable is actually built on a biological level to reward you specifically for planting it right now in the heat. The exact thing that felt like a contradiction to me. Heat season planting for what's supposedly a cool season crop turns out to be the entire point of the timing. That discovery sent me somewhere I didn't expect, because once I understood that biological timing mattered more than conventional calendar wisdom, I started questioning almost everything else I'd assumed about my garden, which is how I ended up at the crop most people don't even consider touching until the following spring. Winter squash. If you've ever grown butternut, acorn delicata, or kabocha, you already know these things take their time, anywhere from 80 days to well over 100, to reach full maturity, depending on the variety. And that single fact is exactly why July matters so much here. The plant too late, and you're racing the first frost with squash that never fully hardens off. The plant now, in July, and you give the fruit enough runway to mature fully and develop the thick, durable rind that lets it store for months afterward in a cool pantry or garage. There's a detail here that took me a long time to fully appreciate, and once I did, it changed how I thought about the entire category. Winter squash isn't really a fall crop, pretending to be a summer one. It's a long-season crop that has to start in summer heat specifically so it can finish during the cooling temperatures of early fall, because that cool-down period is part of what allows the rind to cure properly before storage. Harvest a winter squash too early, while it's still hot and humid outside, and it simply will not store as well. The whole arc, planted in heat, finished in cool air, harvested at exactly the right moment is the design. One word of caution. If you're in a climate with heavy vine borer or squash bug pressure, which is most of the southeastern and southern United States, winter squash planted in July is going to face more insect pressure than a spring planting would, simply because the pest populations have had all summer to build up. Varieties with solid, less hollow stems, like butternut types, tend to resist vine borers noticeably better than the mine, hollow-stemmed varieties. If you've struggled with squash before, this is the detail that probably explains why. So if you're staring at a garden that feels like it's winding down, a packet of winter squash seed is one of the most patient, long-term bets you can make right now. It won't reward you next week. It will reward you in November, sitting in your kitchen, still, perfectly good, while everything else from this season is long gone. By this point in my own garden journey, I started noticing a pattern. Every crop that seemed wrong for July was actually built for exactly this moment on a biological level. Which brings me to the one that, once I understood it, completely rewired how I thought about feeding myself through the cold months ahead. Sweet potatoes. If you haven't gotten your slips into the ground yet, July is genuinely your last real window in most climates. And the reason the timing is so unforgiving comes down to one number. Sweet potatoes need a long, warm stretch, often 4 to 5 months from slip to harvest, to properly bulk up underground. Push much past mid-July, and you start running out of warm seasons before those roots have had time to size up into anything worth bulb. What surprised me most, learning this, is that sweet potatoes actually prefer leaner soil than almost everything else we grow, not the rich, heavily composted beds we're taught to build for nearly every vegetable. Give them too much nitrogen and organic matter, and you'll get gorgeous, sprawling vines and disappointingly small roots underneath. What they actually want is sandy, well-draining soil with modest fertility, where phosphorus and potassium matter far more than nitrogen ever will. That single piece of information explained years of mediocre sweet potato harvests for people I know. Gardeners doing everything else right but feeding their sweet potatoes the same way they'd feed a tomato or a pepper. If you can find pre-rooted slips at a nursery this late in the season, since starting your own from scratch now would take 6 to 8 weeks, you don't have get them into lean, sandy soil, and get the timing right. That's the whole formula for a harvest that stores well into winter. We're past the halfway point now, and I want to pause here, because this next crop taught me the most important lesson in this entire video. Cucumbers and summer squash. If yours are still looking healthy right now, producing well, vining out across your beds, I understand the instinct to leave them exactly as they are. Why mess with something that's clearly working? That was my exact thinking. The year my garden went empty in August. Here's the problem with that thinking, and it's one of those facts that, once you know it, you can never plant casually again. Cucumber and squash plants carry a built-in expiration date. They germinate fast, produce fast, and decline fast. Usually within 2 to 3 months from seed, almost regardless of how well you're caring for them. Vine borers, squash bugs, cucumber beetles, powdery mildew. Something is going to take these plants down well before your first frost, no matter what you do to prevent it, which means the plants thriving in your garden today are, quietly, already on a countdown clock. And if we don't start a fresh round now, you're going to hit a stretch in late summer with 0 cucumbers and 0 squash, right when you'd expect your garden to still be at its absolute peak. The fix is one of the simplest things in this entire video. New seed, started now. Either direct sown if your soil is warm enough, which it almost certainly is in July, or started indoors first if pest pressure where you live is a serious problem. That's really it. A rolling succession of young plants means you're never caught with an empty harvest basket, because something new is always coming up right behind whatever's currently fading out. I think about that empty August garden every single time I plant a July succession round. Now, it's the clearest proof I have that the crops looking perfectly fine today can still leave you with absolutely nothing in 6 weeks if you don't plan for what's coming next. Which brings me to a crop most people assume is completely off the table by July. One that genuinely surprised me the first time I actually tried it myself. Fall tomatoes. I know exactly how that sounds. You probably already have tomatoes in the ground right now, maybe even starting to ripen. So planting more tomatoes in July feels backwards, almost redundant. But think about what actually happens to most tomatoes plants by late summer in a hot, humid climate. Disease pressure builds steadily. Productivity drops off. By the time you're deep into August, a lot of spring-planted tomato plants are limping along, not thriving, covered in early blight, or fighting off whatever fungal issue your particular climate throws at them. The move here is starting fast, maturing, disease-resistant varieties from seed right now, specifically choosing ones with short days to maturity, ideally 65 days or fewer if you can find them. Raised properly indoors, those seedlings go into the ground in early August as fresh, disease-free plants, right as your spring tomatoes are giving up the fight. You end up with a genuine second wave of ripe fruit, reaching well into fall, sometimes past your first frost advisory if you're willing to pick the tomatoes green and let them finish ripening indoors, in a cool garage afterward, which can stretch your harvest by another month or two, beyond what most people expect. The first time I did this myself, I remember being almost suspicious of how well it worked. It felt like I was cheating the calendar somehow. I wasn't. I was just refusing to accept that one planting had to be the only planting of the year. And that idea, that nothing has to be the only planting, leads directly into the last crop on this list. The one that, more than any other, proved to me the garden calendar most of us were taught growing up was incomplete from the start. Onions. Here's something that genuinely changes how you think about year-round growing once you actually understand it. Onions are not exclusively a spring crop. They're remarkably heat-tolerant and remarkably cold-tolerant at the same time, which means a properly timed fall crop, started now in July, can give you a harvest in autumn that then stores all the way through winter into the following spring. The detail that matters most here is day length, not just temperature. Onions decide when to bulb based on how many hours of daylight they're getting, which means a fall harvest crop needs short-day varieties specifically bred to bulb as daylight hours shrink heading into autumn. Long day varieties, the ones most people plant in spring, simply won't bulb correctly on a fall schedule no matter how well you care for them. Start the seed indoors now. Transplant out in a few weeks once they're established. And you're looking at a harvest landing somewhere in mid to late fall, right when most other gardens have gone completely quiet for the season. When I finally understood this, it didn't just give me one more crop to add to a list. It gave me an entirely different relationship with my whole growing year. The garden didn't have to go dormant just because. Summer was winding down. It just needed different crops, planted with different timing logic, and July turned out to be the exact month that logic demanded I take action. So here's where all of this lands. 7 crops: beans, carrots, winter squash, sweet potatoes, cucumbers and squash, fall tomatoes and onions. And every single one of them shares the same underlying truth. The plants that look perfectly fine in your garden today are not a guarantee of what your garden will look like 6 weeks from now. The empty beds I stood in front of years ago weren't caused by bad luck or an unusually short growing season. They were caused by me believing July was a finish line, when it's actually the opposite. It's a hinge swinging the entire second half of your gardening year, one way or the other. Now, before you go plant all of this, I want to give you one more piece of the puzzle. Because getting the timing right only matters if these plants actually survive what July throws at them. This is the part of the season where heat, humidity, and insect pressure all peak at the same time, and unprotected plants pay the price for it. Something as simple as insect netting over young brassicas or cucumber starts, or a layer of shade cloth over anything that's struggling in the afternoon sun, can be the difference between a planting that establishes well and one that limps along and never really catches up. I treat covering vulnerable young plants as just as important as the planting decision itself, because all the perfect timing in the world doesn't help you if a wave of pests wipes out your seedlings in the first 10 days. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who wants their garden working for them long after everyone else's has quietly given up for the season. So tell me which one of these 7 crops you're planting first. And if you've successfully grown something late into summer that surprised you the way carrots and onions surprised me, I genuinely want to hear about it in the comments, because that's exactly the kind of detail that makes the next version of this video better for everyone watching it. The version of me standing in that empty August garden didn't know any of this yet. He thought the season was over. It wasn't. It was just waiting for him to plant, like it wasn't. Don't let your July look like my August did.